The Lorax is a cinematic masterpiece combining both kid-friendly animation, Dr. Seuss, one of the most beloved authors of all time, and a subliminal message about how we have destroyed the environment and we need to take action. However, after countless hours of research and watching the Lorax, I can safely say that it has a secondary subliminal message even under the environmental one. I can safely say that the Lorax is a good representation of the Soviet Union in its prime. Now, before we start talking about that, for those of you who haven't seen the Lorax, I will now read a brief synopsis about the movie so that you can get some context and then you'll understand what I'm talking about. Here is the summary. In the town of Thneedville, a walled city, everything is artificial, even the trees, and the air is provided by the O'Hare Corporation for a price. Ted, a young man who likes a girl named Audrey who wants to see a real tree, and thinking that if he can find it, will win her affections. So he talks to his mother and grandmother about it, and his grandmother tells him to seek out someone called the Onceler, which he does. He asks the Onceler what happened to the trees. He tells Ted that it began when he wanted to create something he called a thneed. So he set out to find the material he needs to make it, and when he comes across a forest with trees with the most beautiful leaves, he thinks this is it. So he chops a tree down, but then a creature who calls himself the Lorax, who says he speaks for the trees and all the creatures in the forest, and he says that what he is doing, chopping down a tree, is wrong, but he ignores him, and then stops talking and tells Ted to come back tomorrow. But when Ted tries to go out, O'Hare, who knows what Ted is doing, trying to find a tree, tells him to stop it because it could ruin O'Hare's business, because trees filter out harmful chemicals from the air, and O'Hare's whole business is selling clean air. The Onceler then finishes his story with him becoming a megalomaniac businessman, but eventually being taken out of that mindset after he cuts down the last truffula tree and Thneeds fall out of fashion. And so he's lost his business, his family abandons him, and now he's a hermit who lives in a house outside of Thneedville. And so when he finishes this, he gives Ted the seed to the final truffula tree, which Ted takes and tries to get it to the center of town to plant, but O'Hare decides to try and stop him. And so he sends his security to go after Ted, but with a combined effort of his family, grandmother, mother, and Audrey, he plants it in the center of the town, and they bust into a musical number, and the day is saved in a sense. So now that you have a basic understanding of the Lorax, it's time to talk about why we're here, and that is how the Lorax is a good representation of the Soviet Union in its prime. So we're going to go into the movie, and we're going to look at some clips, and then you're going to hear my reasoning about how I believe the Lorax is connected to the Soviet Union in more ways than one. So now that you have a basic understanding of the Lorax, it's time to talk about why we're here, and that is about how the Lorax is a good representation of the Soviet Union. So we're going to go into the movie, and we're going to look at some clips, and then you're going to hear my reasoning about why I believe the Lorax is connected to the Soviet Union in more ways than one. It's a brand new dawn. The movie starts with a musical number about Thneedville and how amazing it is, but they also say how it's plastic, fake, the air isn't very clean, and they talk about the man O'Hare. Now, what really got me about this song is throughout the entire thing, they're so happy, like they sound so happy and joyful about, one, everything being plastic, two, the air being terrible, there's smog in the sky, and it caught me thinking, like, in the Soviet Union, people were scared because many of the policies that leaders enacted would have to make them revere their leaders, and if they didn't, they could receive disciplinary. So I think that's what happened here. they're doing all these things because they so-called love Thieville, but in reality they don't, and they're just saying this because they've been forced to. Just my 2 cents there.
Mr. O'Hare, what we've got for you is something that is going to take O'Hare Air to the next level.
Now here we meet O'Hare, the leader or owner of Thneedville. Also, he owns a monopoly on air. Because the air is so bad, people buy bottled air in like those giant water jugs and they put them in fans. And so they buy air from him, and since he owns the town, he's the sole provider of the air, and he's gotten rich off the back of it. Now, here, O'Hare represents Stalin, as he is the leader of the Soviet Union, and as he is the leader of Thneedville, Thneedville, of course, represents the Soviet Union as the country. O'Hare must be Stalin, as he has many attributes that would make him connected to Stalin, as you will soon see.
Now, Mr. O'Hare, I know what you're thinking. 1, I've gotten rich selling people air that's fresher than the sticky stuff outside. 2, and here's the important one, how can I possibly make even more money? We can tell you, sir, we can tell you.
Check out this commercial, huh?
Now, if you pause it right here, you can see O'Hare TV. Now, in the Soviet Union, all the press was controlled and it was censored. There was state TV, and that was truly the only channel there. Now, O'Hare, from what we can see here, controls the television and the press, so that would mean that he is censoring people, which is something that the Soviet Union did a lot. And if you made something that was against the government, you could get disciplinary punishment. And as you will soon see, that is exactly what our protagonist, Ted, as you will soon see, will get.
Well, here goes another lame Saturday.
Dude, I don't think so.
Huh? Hey!
Right here.
Man!
Yeah.
What?
Now, what's happening here is, within the story, O'Hare is making a commercial for bottled air. Now, of course, if we're talking about the connotation in the Soviet Union, and how this movie connects to it, the air would be essentially communism, because the Soviet Union was trying to spread communism, and they would create propaganda to say how great communism is and make capitalism seem terrible. And so this is evidently propaganda to make the air seem much better, but the air in this connotation would be communism.
So in other words, the fog in the sky, the more people will buy.
Gee, that's why he's the genius!
This is one part that I would like to touch on. Within Stalin's cabinet, it was shown in multiple documentaries that they flattered Stalin so that they could get on Stalin's good side, so that 1, they wouldn't be targeted by him, and 2, they would have a direct line of succession eventually when Stalin died and a new leader had to be chosen. So them flattering O'Hare like this is very historically accurate. Even O'Hare's temper matches perfectly with Stalin, as when Stalin would get angry, it would often lead to violence or even death. However, death not directly, but often using KGB and having them target whoever made him angry or he doesn't like. And of course, these security guards represent the KGB.
What? Why is he leaving town?
Ted in this movie, who's the protagonist, he represents the Soviet people and how they're trying to escape and trying to disillusion themselves. And so, as Thneedville represents the Soviet Union, Ted trying to escape represents the Soviet people trying to get disillusioned. And so when he leaves, he will, in this case, be crossing the border and going to the West. Keep in mind, the Soviet people have been told that the West, or the outside, is terrible and a disgusting place. So even though the West is very prosperous right now, from their eyes, especially in this movie, it shows how they believe that it's a terrible place. But they still want to go there because they think it can't possibly be worse than this. Now, what you'll come to find is that the Onceler is kind of a double character. The old Onceler that we see here is kind of the knowledge that the Soviet people who cross find from the West and how they get disillusioned. But the younger Onceler, who eventually cuts down all the trees in this movie, that represents how Stalin and Lenin, and the Onceler represents Lenin, how both Lenin and Stalin were trying to industrialize the Soviet Union, and they started cracking down on the agricultural sector. So the Onceler represents Lenin, the young version, trying to crack down on agriculture by cutting down the trees and trying to industrialize, but in turn creating many issues like how he did in the real world by creating a famine.
I was a young man leaving home. Well, here I go, Mom. Off to change the world with my Thneed.
The Thneed is also communism. Essentially, these products that the movie is centered around, those represent communism, and this shows how the essential concept of communism started out as a good thing, the humble beginnings, but eventually it was twisted by these terrible people, and this is shown perfectly in this movie. Now, the Lorax here represents the fight against a communist takeover, kind of like the White Army, which was against the Red Army, or the West, who was against the Soviet Union and communism spreading. So the Lorax essentially represents the resistance, but when the Soviet Union was just beginning, the resistance wasn't enough, and it was still taken over. And so while the Lorax keeps fighting the Onceler, the Lorax eventually loses. The Soviets had planted many listening devices, so if you said anything bad about the government per se, the secret police could come to you. And this is essentially what O'Hare is doing with his security, but in this case, O'Hare, of course, would be Stalin, the security, the secret police, and Ted being the Soviet people, and how they're trying to get away from this place. And so him knowing about this, there was essentially be an analogy for the listening devices that were planted in real life. Eventually, at one point, the Lorax calls the Onceler out for all that he's doing that's hurting the environment. And so the Onceler within the movie bursts into a bit about how bad can it truly be. But there's one part, well, okay, there's two parts in this song that I really want to focus on that really hammer in the point about this movie having many Soviet connections.
Come on, how bad can it possibly be? How bad can I be? I'm just building the economy. How bad can I be? Just look at me petting this puppy. How bad can I be? A portion of proceeds goes to charity.
That part and how you hear the little voice saying all portions of profit go to charity, and how it's really just the guy's dad, that shows how much corruption there was with the Soviets, and there still is within Russia. I think it showcases that really well, and then there's another part that I would like to show you.
This is all gratifying! How bad How bad can this possibly be?
This part shows within the movie about how much of a megalomaniac the Once has become, but also within the real world, I believe it shows how ruthless the Soviets were with industrializing and many other sectors. Now, we're nearing the end of this video. There's just a couple more things, and then we'll reach the conclusion.
The last Truffula seed.
This Truffula seed represents the spark that the Soviet people needed to start a rebellion or disillusion themselves from what all the leaders previously have told them. In the movie, it represents the way to bring down O'Hare and start the trees again. And so this is essentially what the people needed to get rid of their tyrannical dictator.
Yeah, I know.
One thing I didn't mention previously was Thneedville has a giant iron or steel wall around it, and the Soviet Union had the Iron Curtain, which was an unofficial barrier between the Soviet Union and the West, essentially an ideological barrier because of the Iron Curtain and how closed off it was. Because all the Soviet puppet states and the Soviet Union itself, they had little to no communication with the West. And so they had the Iron Curtain, they have an iron wall boxing them in.
I am Ted Wiggins, and I speak for the trees. And the fact is, things aren't perfect here in Thneedville. And they're only gonna get worse unless we do something about it!
This is essentially just the protesting that took place near the end of the Soviet Union before it collapsed. And then we get to the credits of the movie. So that's everything that the movie has to offer. That is everything that the movie that really shows the connection between the movie and the Soviet Union and teaches people about communism and how it's not really the best thing, or at least it isn't in the way that we've executed it so far. So that is the conclusion to this. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. If you have a different idea or have anything to add on, please tell me. But anyways, that's the end. Goodbye.